The city bus was packed with passengers, the seats fully occupied and the aisles filled with people holding onto the metal poles to keep their balance. It was a typical late afternoon in Riverside, Alabama. The air was thick with the faint smell of diesel and the low buzz of conversations filling the space, a constant hum that everyone had become accustomed to. In one of the middle rows sat Ethan Parker, a young man in his early 20s, his sharp jawline tense and set in frustration. His voice sliced through the low murmur of the bus. "How could you forget that, Mom? Seriously, it's embarrassing." He waved his hands around, gesturing wildly at his mother, Dorothy Parker, an elderly woman with silvery hair and kind, tired eyes. She fidgeted nervously with the strap of her purse, her gaze focused downward, avoiding the eyes of the people around them. "Sorry, Ethan," Dorothy murmured, her voice barely audible. "I thought I put it in the bag before we left." Ethan groaned loudly, tossing his head back as if the entire world was conspiring against him. "You always do this. It's like you can't keep track of anything. No wonder Dad got frustrated with you," he continued, his voice rising with each word. His angry words hung in the air, heavy with the sting of past arguments. The gasps from the passengers were faint but audible. A woman seated near the front glanced over disapprovingly, while a man further back muttered something under his breath, but no one dared to intervene. Not yet. At the back of the bus, sitting straight and composed with his hands resting on his knees, was a tall, black man dressed in a military uniform. His name tag read Liam Harris. His presence was commanding, yet quiet. The rows of medals on his chest spoke of years of service, a lifetime of commitment, but his face remained unreadable. As Ethan's voice grew louder, berating his mother over what seemed like a forgotten grocery item, Liam's sharp eyes flicked towards the scene unfolding before him. His posture remained unmoving, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly, as if processing the situation. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of red. She whispered again, almost pleading, "Please, Ethan, not here. Let's talk about it later." "Talk about it later?" Ethan snapped, louder this time, ensuring that everyone could hear his anger. "You never listen. You always ruin everything. No wonder things ended the way they did with Dad." The tension in the air was palpable, growing heavier with each passing second. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while a teenager, seated near the front, discreetly pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll through it but angling the screen just enough to catch the scene. No one said anything. But there was a shift, a quiet tension that no one could ignore. At the back of the bus, Liam's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the increasing hostility from the young man. Ethan's words continued to rise in volume, each insult more cutting than the last. Ethan's voice cracked as he lashed out again. "You know, this is why Dad left. You've always been a mess, always have been." His words were harsh, loud enough for everyone on the bus to hear. Dorothy's face crumpled at the remark. A tear slipped down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away, hoping no one would notice, but of course they all did. The collective discomfort on the bus grew. People who had been trying to ignore the confrontation could no longer look away. Liam, seated at the back, remained calm, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. He didn't speak, but his eyes never left Ethan. The passengers seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for someone to step in. Ethan continued to berate his mother, growing more hostile with each word, his voice now rising sharply. "You can't do anything right. Why do I even bother with you?" Dorothy flinched, her hands clutching her purse tightly. She made herself smaller, trying to disappear into the seat, as if retreating into herself would shield her from the storm of verbal attacks. A man in his 30s, standing near the front of the bus, adjusted his tie and glanced over his shoulder. His face showed a mix of discomfort and hesitation, unsure whether he should speak up. The woman beside him whispered, "Someone should say something," but no one did. Not yet. Liam's hand subtly clenched into a fist on his knee. His gaze remained locked on Ethan, studying him closely. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was something much more calculated, a quiet assessment of the situation. He didn't say a word. He just... The teenager recording the scene on her phone tapped her friend's shoulder, her excitement palpable. "This is going to blow up online," she whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. Her friend glanced at her, shaking her head. "It's just sad," she murmured, looking at the unfolding drama with a mix of pity and concern. At the back of the bus, Liam Harris, a tall man in a crisp military uniform, straightened his posture. His hands, which had been relaxed on his knees, now gripped the edge of his seat. His gaze never wavered, and though his expression remained neutral, there was a shift in the air, a quiet but undeniable determination. As Ethan Parker opened his mouth to throw another insult, a soft yet commanding voice broke through the tension. "You man!" The voice came from a woman sitting a few rows ahead. She turned slightly in her seat, her eyes filled with disapproval. "Don't you think you've said enough?" Ethan froze, startled by the interruption. For a moment his face twisted into a scowl, and he sneered back. "This isn't your business, lady." But before the situation could escalate further, Liam stood up. The sheer presence of the man was enough to draw every eye on the bus. He was tall, his military uniform sharp and immaculate, and the calm authority in his posture was impossible to ignore. With slow, deliberate steps, he made his way down the aisle. The bus, which had been filled with muffled murmurs and shifting feet, now fell eerily quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine, which seemed to fade away in the face of the unfolding scene. As Liam approached, Ethan shrank in his seat. His earlier bravado faltered under the weight of Liam's unyielding gaze. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, watching in anticipation. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for, the moment when someone finally took action. Liam stopped just a few feet away from Ethan, his towering presence casting a shadow over the young man. He looked at Ethan, then shifted his gaze to Dorothy Parker, the elderly woman sitting next to him. Her cheeks streaked with silent tears, she looked down, avoiding everyone's eyes. Liam exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Before speaking, "I wasn't going to say anything," Liam began, his voice deep and steady, carrying an undeniable authority. "But sitting back and watching this, that's not something I can do." Ethan's defiance flared momentarily. "What are you going to do, lecture me now?" he snapped, though his voice wavered under Liam's steady gaze. Liam ignored the outburst and instead focused his attention on Dorothy. He crouched slightly to bring himself to her eye level and spoke gently. "Ma'am, you deserve respect, especially from your own blood." His words were soft, but they held a weight that made the entire bus fall silent. Turning back to Ethan, Liam straightened up, his voice firm and measured. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Someone who thought they had all the time in the world to say sorry." Ethan blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone defensive. Liam tilted his head slightly, his expression hard to read. "I served 20 years in the military," he said slowly, "seen places you wouldn't believe, done things I still carry with me every single day. But nothing haunts me more than the day I buried my mother." The bus fell completely silent. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background. The weight of Liam's words settled over the bus, and every passenger seemed to lean in to catch what he was saying. Liam's voice grew quieter, forcing everyone to focus on his every word. "I was a young man full of myself, thought I knew better than the woman who raised me," Liam continued, his tone now laced with pain. "She'd call me, ask how I was doing, and I'd brush her off. 'I'm busy, Mom,' I'd say. 'I'll call you later.' But later never came. One day I got the call. She was gone." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier bravado, the sharp edge to his words, had dissolved. Now there was something else, something he wasn't ready to confront. Liam stepped closer, his voice dropping even lower. Do you know what it feels like to stand over a casket, wishing for just one more chance to say, "I'm sorry"? To tell her you mattered to me, that you loved her, but you can't because it's too late? The tension in the bus was suffocating. The elderly woman, Dorothy, wiped her face with trembling hands. Her lips pressed together as though trying to hold back a sob. Liam leaned slightly toward Ethan, his tone sharp. "Don't be the kind of man who waits until it's too late. That's a regret you'll carry forever." Ethan's face flushed, his lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. His hands clenched around the fabric of his jeans and his head dropped slightly lower. The entire bus seemed frozen, as though no one dared to break the moment. Then Ethan's response shattered the silence, and it wasn't what anyone had expected. Ethan sat motionless for a moment, his knuckles white as they gripped his jeans. The bravado he had flaunted earlier was gone, replaced by a fragile stillness. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes met Liam's, and the defiance had drained from his face, leaving something raw and vulnerable in its place. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely a whisper. I didn't mean," he faltered, swallowing hard. I didn't mean to hurt her." The words hung in the air, trembling like a fragile thread. Dorothy's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, but she said nothing, her silence heavy with emotion. Liam didn't move, his gaze steady and unrelenting, as if he was waiting for Ethan to truly hear himself. Liam stepped back, his towering frame retreating slightly as the moment shifted. He glanced around the bus, meeting the eyes of a few passengers who nodded silently. Their expressions were filled with respect and understanding. The tension that had gripped the bus seemed to ease, the atmosphere lightening just slightly. But then something unexpected happened, something that shocked everyone. As the bus rolled to a stop at a red light, a voice from the back startled the passengers. It was the elderly man seated near the emergency exit, someone no one had noticed until now. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly but strong enough to carry through the bus. "You man," he called out to Ethan, "you've taken the first step, don't stop now." All eyes turned to the older gentleman, his weathered face telling a story of years of hard-earned wisdom. He adjusted his flat cap and continued, his tone firm but not unkind. "I lost my son a few years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Do you know what I'd give for just 5 minutes to tell him how much I loved him? Don't waste the time you've got." Ethan's face turned a deeper shade of red. His eyes welled up with tears he couldn't hold back. He glanced at his mother, her hand still resting gently on his. For the first time in what seemed like forever, there was no judgment in her gaze, only understanding. Ethan looked around the bus, realizing how many strangers had witnessed his shame and his apology. He stood up abruptly, taking his mother's hand. "Come on, Mom," he said, his voice trembling but steady. "Let's get off here. I want to talk, really talk." The passengers parted to let them through, some offering soft smiles, others giving slight nods of encouragement as they exited the bus. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Liam watched them leave, his expression unreadable. But, as the doors closed behind them, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He returned to his seat, leaning back with a sense of quiet accomplishment. A few rows ahead, the teenager who had been recording the entire scene stopped the video, hesitated for a moment, and then deleted it. "Not everything needs to go online," she muttered to her friend, who nodded in agreement. The bus continued its journey, and though the hum of conversation slowly returned, the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't just mindlessly scrolling their phones or staring out the window anymore. They were reflecting on family, on forgiveness, on the fragile, fleeting nature of time. As the bus neared Liam's stop, the man seated next to him finally spoke. "That was something back there," he said quietly. "The way you handled that, it made me think. I haven't called my mom in weeks. I think I'll do that tonight." Liam smiled faintly, standing as the bus came to a halt. "You should," he said. "One call can make all the difference." As Liam stepped off the bus and into the afternoon sunlight, the passengers watched him go. His quiet strength had left an impression, one they wouldn't soon forget. This story reminds us that time with our loved ones is precious, that the words we speak, whether kind or cruel, carry weight and can shape the bonds we share. Respect, humility, and gratitude are lessons worth learning before it's too late. If this story moved you, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love. Say the words you've been meaning to say. And if you want more stories that inspire and make you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's spread kindness together.